Once again, I'm Andria, Sigler Smalz, and I am a clinical pastoral counselor with Journey Christian Ministries in Lake Elsinore, California. And what we're going to be talking about today is nature or nurture, can we trust the research? This is a very debated topic, and it's a topic that's hard to research, especially if you're not a scientist like I am not a scientist. I spent probably weeks and weeks reading and watching YouTube videos of people like this and studying books and everything to even make sense out of it and to come up with something that helped me understand why the research seems to indicate such contradictory positions. So in just starting off, I would like to just kind of poll this small audience here. How many of you believe that it is nature that creates a homosexual orientation? Nobody. Okay. How many believe it's nurture? Okay. How many believe it's both? How many say we have no clue? Okay. You may be right. Okay. Do any of you believe that gender expectations in regards to sexuality are purely a social construct? And maybe homosexuality is a normal variation? Or have you talked to people that believe that the society creates the gender expectations? Okay. And sometimes we hear that homosexuality is purely a spiritual problem, right? If somebody would just read more, pray more, be what God wanted them to be, then they wouldn't have this issue. We hear that too. So what I want to address in this is to help us all understand why there's such a discrepancy in opinion when it comes to this issue. You'll often hear people express opinions. They use as their authority phrases like studies show and science says or psychological researchers have found. And these are really convincing words. We have this idea that science is a hard field of study instead of an art. And I really beg to differ there. If we look at the dictionary definition, science is knowledge about or it's a study of the natural world based on facts learned through experiments and observations. Psychology is a scientific study of the human mind and its functions, especially those affecting behavior in a given context. Now, these are really lofty claims, and what we're going to look at today to see if the research stands up to these claims. Now, most of us probably remember the scientific method from like elementary school. I think I did some little thing about why a stick could float, You make an observation, you do background research, you construct your hypothesis, you test your hypothesis by conducting an experiment, you analyze your data, you draw a conclusion, you communicate the results. It's really clean, isn't it? And then you know for sure. It's not that simple, is it? Most of the topics that we're interested in understanding. And to complicate it, we live in this Tower of Babel age where we endow science and ourselves with knowledge and powers that we really yet don't possess. And in reality, there's a lot of pop science being passed on as the real thing. And there's a lot of bad science being passed on as true. And there's also just a lot of misinterpretation of what science says because the media and us, the general population, don't understand terminology. There's also a lot of that science still doesn't know and is in the process of trying to learn. But I'm not the only one that believes that. We're going to hear about a scientist who believes that also. I'm going to refer to him in a minute, but if you want to take note of this, Dr. John Ioannidis, he did a lecture at Stanford University, Why Most Research Findings Are False. It was an incredible video. I'm presenting some of the stuff he said here, and some is from other sources, and because I'm not a scientist, so I don't have my own sources to present to you. But because there is such discrepancies, this whole field of meta-analysis has been on the rise for a couple decades or so. And what meta-analysis is, it's a statistical technique, and it's used to combine data and results from more than one independent study on a topic. And by doing this, what the hope is is that patterns within various study results will be identified and disagreements among results will be seen, or maybe other interesting information will come to light in surface of the multiple studies. Meta-analysis has its own set of problems, and I've included this, the name with this, where you can watch the YouTube video if you're interested. But it does address some of the problems in the field of science that plague research and research claims. So Dr. Ioannidis produced a paper titled "Why Most Published Research Findings Are False." And while he's an advocate of science, he doesn't demonize the field, because he is a scientist, but he's candid and he's humble and he's honest about the limitations of science and its flaws. He shares about their attempts to replicate studies that were published in top medical journals. Some information that is the most cited, and how 5 out of 6 non-randomized trials were either untrue or grossly exaggerated, and how 25% of randomized trials were found to be completely wrong or grossly exaggerated. He even mentions the fake science paper hoax that was submitted by John Bohannon of Harvard University over a 10-month period to over 304 professional open access journals, and how 51% of them accepted the paper. 20% of them were considering it, and only 32% rejected this bogus paper that supposedly anyone with a little more than a high school education in chemistry should have recognized as hopelessly flawed. The paper boasted a cancer wonder drug. In genetic association studies for risks to particular diseases, such as major depressive disorder and others, here's what they found when they tried to replicate these studies. For instance, it was originally thought that there were 57 associated genes for depressive disorder. 7 years later, when they attempted larger studies to replicate and verify results, only 1 gene survived the replication efforts. And in fact, out of all the genetic association tests they reran with larger sampling, they found a 99% false positive rate in the original testing. Only 1% was found to be accurate. There was another gene study. It was found that the UCHL1, which stands for ubiquitin carboxyl terminase hydrolase, it's a protein coding gene. They thought it was a Parkinson's disease susceptibility gene. So if you had this gene, you would be susceptible to having Parkinson's. The study was an effort that involved stellar scientists around the world and a very, very large sampling size. The testing was impeccable, the team was qualified, they thought they had eliminated the biases, and the results were published in a very respectable medical journal. Less than 2 years later, other scientists retested, and they combined that study with a study 3 times larger, and it was discovered and published in the same journal that UCHL1, it's not a Parkinson's disease susceptibility gene. It has absolutely no effect. Then down the road, somebody took all the prior data and the last 2 studies, and they did a meta-analysis of meta-analysis, and their results were that UCLH1 is a Parkinson's disease susceptibility gene, and this was published. And this is almost laughable. Then they decided to utilize a larger consortium with 10 times larger sampling size to try and obtain a definitive answer, because, come on, either it is or it isn't, right? What they now believe to be that definitive answer is that UCHL1 is not a Parkinson's disease susceptibility gene. However, now no one's going to publish those results. So the literature still stands that it is, at least as of the time of this article. Analysis was also conducted to see how many papers published within specific fields of science claim significant results in relation to a hypothesis. Significant results means something that really changes the field. And what they found was that the field of physics and space science claim very low significant results. Not much happens that adds something incredible to the body of knowledge we have. It's slow, it's over time. But fields like pharmacology, psychology, and bioscience, which includes genetics and food science and ecology and biochemistry, those claim high significant results. So that means new discoveries that supposedly improve something and contribute new knowledge happen frequently in those fields. So what they found was that fields that have a low number of discovery of significant results, meaning new information, they have very high standards of accountability and require replication for their research, because to put forth claims in those fields that are later rebutted, they are an embarrassing career ender. However, in the field of genetics, field of medicine, psychology, there exists a culture where no one tries to replicate that often. And what Dr. Ioannidis found was that only 3 to 4% of claims had results that were replicated, and even those, when done, were usually done by the same team of people. In the US, there is more pressure for a researcher in certain fields to obtain some type of profound or extreme finding in order to get published, because their credibility comes with publishing. You know, you want to get your name out there, you have to publish. If you're going to publish, you have to have something new to say. So there's the pressure to find that new thing, to make that new discovery. Now bear with me here. I'm going to talk about how this applies to the studies on homosexuality. There's another example, though, if you research online, a California-based company called Amgen. It's a multinational biopharmaceutical company. And you'll find the following when you research them. Only 6 out of 53 landmark studies for Amgen oncology drug target projects could be replicated. And if my math is right, that's about 11%. Begley and Ellis in 2012 wrote that the failure to win the war on cancer has been blamed on many factors, but recently a new culprit has emerged. Too many basic scientific discoveries are just wrong. So in general, it's now thought that on an average, at least 50% of published studies, even those in top medical journals, academic journals, can't be replicated with the same conclusions by an outside lab. And because of this, some investors are now enlisting independent contract resource labs to validate claims before investing their money. In studies involving what's called biological plausibility, that's when you try to establish a cause and effect relationship between a biological factor and a particular disease or an adverse event. Dr. Ioannidis says, and I quote, "In most circumstances, in my experience, biological plausibility in a number of empirical studies that we have done is overinflated. It is overinterpreted. People use biological plausibilities in ways that suit their needs. And much of the time, it is post hoc. They find the result, and then they draw a circle around it. Any result can be explained away as being plausible. I cannot think of any result that someone cannot summon biological plausibility." Now, I'm not sharing all of this information in order to bash science. I'm just sharing this because I was not aware, even until doing this research, of what the problems are within a research field. I was one of those people that said, psychologists say, science says. And in other words, we want to know, though, what isn't working so that we can also understand what the research says and doesn't say about homosexuality. And also, I may be teaching this workshop because I want to change that godlike perception that we hold in our culture of science and bring it back to a humble reality that this is the real definition of science, at least it's mine. Science, whether we're talking about the field of psychology, natural science, genetic science, any of his fields, is man's attempt to understand the world that God has created. It's our attempt, and our attempts are going to be imperfect. It's also questionable in my mind whether a researcher can separate themselves from their worldview lens. We live in an impatient time in society where people want answers now. We want to cure cancer now. We want to know what causes homosexuality now. And we demand from the scientific community that they give us those answers. Fame and money are also motivators. And sometimes it's just a matter of scientists are people like us and they think more highly of themselves than we ought. So what goes wrong in research? Probably the two biggest issues are bias and random error. Random error is errors in measurement that can vary from one measurement to another. These could include out-and-out fraud. They can include negligence or inadvertent errors, mistakes. Or they could include imperfectly designed experiments, misclassifications, differences between sample populations. It could be biological variability in study participants. There's a whole slew of possibility of errors. And then bias, using computer programs, they found that 235 different types of possible bias can surface in various types of research. They include design, selection sampling, omission, who you put out of a study, who you allow into a study, how you measure procedures. There could be cultural biases, there could be self-serving biases, there could be interpretive biases, race, confounding, which is some factor that they didn't think to control, gender, sex, publication, response reporting, many, many more. There's all kinds of biases that can enter into research interpretation that skew results. Now we can move on to what you're here for, the studies regarding homosexuality. The media would have us believe that the question of a biological basis for homosexuality has already been settled, and that people are born gay, and that you are ignorant, and you are homophobic if you think otherwise. At this point in time, the facts don't lend to the media's version of the story. In actuality, there is evidence on both sides of the question. And the subject needs far more study by researchers who don't have an investment in the answer coming out in any particular direction. Okay. So the possible theories for the biological basis of homosexuality, they fit within the following categories: brain structure, possible hormonal influences, the concordance of homosexuality in twins, concordance of genetic markers in siblings, and real genetic studies, or GWAS. So those are the possible biological theories. These are the ones that have been studied. So if we were to start with brain structure, who knows what the hypothalamus is? Sonia, tell me. Right. It's a section of the brain responsible for hormone production. It also governs body temperature and thirst and hunger and sleep and moods and sex drive and the release of other hormones in our body. So this area of the brain controls the pituitary gland and other glands in the body. Now, there was a study conducted that showed the brains of males possessed a greater twofold difference in size in the preoptic level of the hypothalamus, which serves as that thermoregulator. A second study showed that 2 out of 4 of the INAH were at least twice as large in males as in females. The INAH stands for the interstitial nuclei of the anterior hypothalamus. It's believed to affect the differences in size and other physical characteristics between genders. So it makes sense that they would be trying to study this. So this led a man, we all know this guy, right? Simon LeVay, the gay British-American neuroscientist, to hypothesize that maybe there's a difference in this region of the brain between male homosexuals and heterosexual men. So post-mortem examination of the brains, and listen for the biases, of AIDS patients, presumed to be gay, were compared with the post-mortem examination of men presumed to be homosexual, but who did not have AIDS. The study showed that the heterosexual men demonstrated INAH3 that were twice the size of the homosexual men who had died of AIDS. Now, if you were listening carefully, you saw some errors right there. You saw bias and you saw random error. And for this reason, the study's been criticized by the scientific community. But what we saw was the sexual preference and orientation of all the subjects was really unverified. It was presumed that if someone died of AIDS, they were gay. It was presumed that they could not have been heterosexual. We had a researcher who was gay. We had a researcher who had lost a lover to AIDS, and he had a self-interest in the outcome of the study. And then here comes the media, who considers themselves to be agents of social change, right? We don't have news reporters anymore. We have agents of social change. And they have no training in science, and they love to soundbite and sensationalize news headlines because it sells newspapers, it sells magazines, and it takes too long to explain it. So they made claims that a genetic basis to homosexuality had been discovered based on Simon LeVay's experiment, when actually genetic testing wasn't even a part of this study. So Simon LeVay, who obviously must have believed in his research enough to publish it and didn't see the random errors and biases at the time he was doing the study, he stated that the most common error people made in interpreting his research is in that thinking that he proved that men are born gay. And he denied making any claim to locating a gay center in the brain. A subsequent study by a man named Bine looked at the question of INAH size in regards to sex and sexual orientation and HIV status. The study only found large differences between male and female, with the exception of heterosexual men who had contracted AIDS. There was no difference based upon sexual orientation. And there was no statistically significant difference between homosexual men and heterosexual men who had contracted AIDS. So this study indicated that LeVay's study was extremely flawed with confounding biases. Further studies of the hypothalamus were conducted by Schwab, and they were based on prior hypotheses claiming that differentiation of the hypothalamus occurred before birth. But Schwab's study showed that in more than 100 subjects, the sexually dimorphic nucleus, what causes sexual differences, decreased in volume and cell number 2 to 4 years after birth in females. So this information complicated the brain studies because now it's difficult to tell whether social factors are also influencing chemical and hormonal factors. In 1992, a study by Allen and Gorski examined the anterior commissure, the bundle of nerve fibers connecting the two cerebral hemispheres of the brain. And they found that females and homosexual males exhibited a larger size than heterosexual males. However, later studies, 1993, 2001, 2002, using larger sampling sizes by two separate teams of researchers, found no such differences, and they found classification errors in the original studies. So you can kind of see it going back and forth, just like the cancer studies and then some of the other ones. And then confusing this issue even more, there's evidence showing that sexual experiences in and of themselves can affect brain structure. In fact, the whole topic of neuroplasticity or brain plasticity is about how the brain is capable of reorganizing itself in areas of thinking, emotions, and behavior. So enough of the brain, let's move on to hormonal influences. This is boring, isn't it? But I think you're going to go away with something that's important. Scientists believe sexual orientation occurs within the womb as a result of hormonal differences. That's what some believe. So it's been hypothesized that a hormonal imbalance within the womb could be responsible for the creation of a homosexual orientation. If our sexual orientation is created in the womb, well then, if something goes wrong hormonally, that would sound logical. Since at this time there isn't a way to study hormone levels in the womb, researchers looked for proxies such as skeletal size and shape that are normally found in women and men that would be indicative of hormone levels. So here's a summary of what was studied and compared in homosexual men, heterosexual men, homosexual women, and heterosexual women. The second and fourth digit in relation to the middle finger, which is known to be different in men versus women, the length of the long bones in the arms, legs, and hands, and they examined these variables in light of another theory that states that the more older brothers a subject has, the higher the incidence of homosexuality. This research done in these areas thus far is mostly inconclusive because some studies, once again, contradict other studies. There's yet much to be understood here regarding the effects of hormones on the origin of homosexuality. If there was a study, perhaps, that could document real hormone levels as opposed to proxies in utero, perhaps that would yield more information. But the scientific community isn't there yet, and you would have to also find out a way to rule out environment when it comes to the older brother studies, because that would throw a whole nother confounding issue to it. Twin studies. In an attempt to ascertain possible genetic factors, twin studies were initiated. The early studies suffered from methodological flaws, such as utilizing sampled subjects that were only from correctional institutions or psychiatric facilities, or investigators who advertised only in gay publications, which would also skew the sampling. Later, a study from the same group that didn't suffer from the same selection bias, they found the heritability rate in Australia to be 50 to 60% in males and 30% in females. Now, we remember seeing the headlines on this, right? Scientists showed that homosexuality is inherited, has an inheritability rate, 50%. Now, what does heritability rate mean? It's often assumed that the heritability of a particular trait correlates to how much influence a trait exerts on the person. But it's not what it means, which is another mistake the media makes. First, heritability says nothing about a particular individual. It only says something about a population. Second, here are examples to help you understand heritability. If you were to perfectly control an environment, all of a person's experiences, all their interactions with everyone they come in contact with, and this group of people's lives were identical in every way, but they develop traits that are different from one another, you would say that the heritability rate would be 100%, because then only genes could be responsible for differences. Conversely, if you could create a population of clones, individuals who are genetically identical in every way, and subject them to all different environments, but they develop traits that are different from one another, you would say that the heritability would be 0%, because any differences can't be attributed to the genes because they were clones. It had to be completely the environment. So the term heritability says nothing about any one individual. It speaks in generalities about a population, and it doesn't mean that something is directly inherited. In 2000, a man named Kendler sampled 1,588 twins in the US from a random survey, and he found that 3% of the population consisted of non-heterosexuals, either homosexual or bisexual, and with a genetic concordance rate of 32%. Concordance is the probability that both will share a trait if one of the twins has a particular trait. Now, the study has lost statistical significance when it was examined in light of male and female pairs because the sampling of 3% was just too small. So twin studies suffer from two obvious problems. First, because contrary to what the media would like you to believe, the most reliable researchers, even some from the gay community, put the homosexual population at around 3.3%. And the Twins Foundation put the population of twins at 2% of the 3.3%. So that sampling is not abundant for studies. We're talking about 3.3% of 2%, which is 0.000066%. It's hard to study a population that small and come up with something that is true or understandable. Also, in addition to sharing parents, siblings, schools, friends, and other family members, twins are often dressed alike, they play together, they share activities, so there would be a high degree of a shared environment. However, even their entire environment and the interactions between each of them and their environment, it can't be entirely controlled. It's impossible to tell what's nature and what's nurture because they're usually raised together in the same environment. You'd really have to locate twins who are not only raised apart to control all the factors, but also not raised by other family members. At the time of the article that I read, only 6 to 10 twin boys had been located who were raised apart and not by a family member. And with these numbers, replication is really impossible when you do a study. So here are some other facts that cause me to believe that nurture plays a very big role in the development of homosexuality. If homosexuality was all about nature, we would expect consistent population percentages across the board, whether a person is raised by heterosexuals or homosexuals. In a study by Walter Schumann, 262 children raised by homosexual parents, 16 to 57% of those children adopted a homosexual lifestyle, and even higher statistics for daughters, 33 to 57% for daughters of lesbians that adopted a homosexual lifestyle. The range is due to an odds ratio due to the mix of child parent genders. Now, this study's been challenged, it's been criticized, but the detailed analysis was pretty flawless. Other researchers have rechecked it, replied to criticisms, and so far it seems to be standing. So you would expect to see the same ratio, but you see a highly increased ratio of children choosing homosexuality, experiencing homosexuality that are raised by parents where one or both is gay, as opposed to kids that are raised by heterosexual parents. If we move on to genetics, as researchers examined families, it appeared that homosexual men had more homosexual relatives through their maternal lineage than their paternal lineage. So rather than question environment, the speculation went to a linkage on the X chromosome passed down from the maternal side. A researcher, Dean Hammer, found such an association at the region XQ28, so you've heard about the XQ28 studies. Now, allele is a member of a pair of genes located on a specific position on a chromosome, usually arising through mutation. These DNA codings, they determine distinct traits which can get passed on from parents to children. So if a male homosexual orientation is influenced on a gene on KQ28, then gay brothers should share more than 50% of their alleles at this region, while their heterosexual brothers should share less than 50% of their alleles. And in the absence of such association, both types of brothers should share 50% of their alleles at KQ28. So they analyzed 40 pairs of gay brothers, and they found they shared 82% of their alleles at the XQ28 region. So that was substantially higher than 50%. So this is looking promising here for the other side. A follow-up study by the same group of researchers using 32 pairs of gay brothers came up with only 60% of shared alleles at this region. And then an attempt to repeat the study by another group of researchers came up with only 46%. Another independent team corroborated the last results of 46%. So the bottom line is that there's no gene or gene product from XQ28 that has been shown to influence sexual orientation. But even when the original researcher who came up with the higher percentage asked if he believed his study, what percentage of homosexuality his study could account for, he said probably 5%. So within the last decade, the ability to conduct genome studies has grown in advances in technology. There's been a few studies on 7q36 with conflicting results. The largest genome study was conducted by 23andMe. They scanned 7,887 unrelated men and 5,570 unrelated women. It was the largest genome-wide study for this topic. The data was presented at the American Society of Human Genetics meeting in San Francisco, showing that there was no association with sexual orientation, including XQ28 and 7q36. So while there's much yet to be studied, preliminary data rules out genetic association. Now, if we were to look at abusive childhood experiences, moving back to the nurture topic, in New Zealand, 13,000 adults 16 and above, they were examined to assess a correlation between childhood abuse and homosexuality. What the study found was that 15% of the homosexuals had experienced childhood abuse as opposed to 5% in the general population. So if this study accurately represents the picture, that still would only count for 10% of homosexuality. Then there's one other argument, and then there's one other interesting fact. Dr. Lisa Diamond, a University of Utah professor, She's a researcher and she's a gay activist. She's done extensive research on what she calls the fluidity of sexuality. She found that only 2% of men